welcome to the Deep Dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're digging into a question that, well, I think it's crossed everyone's mind at some point. If you've ever tried to stick with a new habit or maybe chase a big goal, how do you actually keep that drive going?
Yeah, long after the initial excitement wears off.
Exactly. It's a universal challenge, really. That initial buzz, it just doesn't last forever.
No, it definitely doesn't carry you the whole way.
So our source material for this deep dive is Chapter 19 of James Clear's Atomic Habits.
A really popular one, and for good reason.
Right. And look, we know there's a lot of talk out there about motivation, but we're not really aiming for just surface-level advice here.
No, we want to go deeper.
Our mission for you, the learner, is to pull out some genuinely actionable, maybe even slightly surprising insights from Clear on how to really keep motivated with habits for the long haul.
We're looking for the mechanics behind it, what actually works.
Okay, so to get us started, let's maybe think about Steve Martin.
The comedian.
Yeah. We all know him now as this, incredibly successful, hilarious guy. But his path wasn't sudden at all.
Right. It took time. A lot of time.
Clear points to this really striking timeline. 10 years, just learning his craft.
10 years.
Then another 4 years honing it, refining. And only then did he have what he called 4 years of wild success.
Wow. So that's, what, nearly 2 decades?
Pretty much. Nearly 2 decades of dedication before hitting that peak.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about the long game, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It wasn't an overnight thing.
On those early days, they weren't glamorous.
Mm-hmm.
Not at all. He was playing these tiny clubs in L.A., often doing these really short sets, maybe 5 minutes, for just a handful of people.
Small crowds.
Sometimes crowds that were barely paying attention. And get this, he even talks about performing his routine to a completely empty room.
Wow. Just practicing out loud, I guess.
Must have been.
Yeah.
So what kept him going through all that? Through years of what must have felt like, well, very little reward coming back.
Yeah, what was the engine driving that persistence?
Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the chapter brings in this core idea. Clear calls it the Goldilocks rule.
Goldilocks. Like the porridge.
Exactly like the porridge. The idea is basically that our motivation peaks when we're working on tasks that are in that sweet spot of difficulty.
All right.
Just manageable difficulty, as Clear puts it. So not so easy that you're bored stiff.
Right.
And not so challenging that you just want to give up in frustration.
But right there, kind of on the edge of what you could do.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Right on the edge of your current abilities.
Clear uses that tennis analogy, which I think is so spot on.
Yeah, that works really well.
Like, imagine playing tennis against a 4-year-old. Sure, you'd win every point, but
You'd be bored out of your mind in minutes.
wholly checked out. Now, flip it. Picture stepping onto the court against, say, Roger Federer or Serena Williams.
Okay, yeah. Terrifying.
You might get a lucky shot in, maybe, but mostly you just feel completely overwhelmed.
And probably pretty discouraged, right? Zero chance.
Exactly. But playing against someone who's roughly at your own level,
That's where it gets interesting.
that's where the engagement is. You're invested, you're thinking, because you feel like you have a real shot, but you have to actually focus. You have to be present.
And what's really fascinating here is that this isn't just like a nice idea. There's a real psychological principle behind it.
Oh, yeah.
It's called the Yerkes-Dodson law. Basically, it shows there's an optimal level of arousal-like mental stimulation for peak performance.
Right.
And that sweet spot isn't being totally relaxed, and it isn't being completely stressed out either.
It's somewhere in the middle.
Exactly. It's that middle ground, which lines up perfectly with the Goldilocks rule, right? Enough challenge to keep you engaged, but not so much that it just leads to anxiety and burnout.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's bring this back to Steve Martin then. How did his early comedy career sort of embody this Goldilocks rule, even if he didn't, know the term?
Well, Clear details how Martin would deliberately push himself, but always in a very incremental way.
Small steps.
Tiny steps, yeah. Each year, he'd typically only add maybe a minute or two of new material to his act.
Just a minute or two.
Yeah. He wasn't trying to, reinvent his entire show every few months.
Well, he wasn't throwing everything out.
No. And crucially, he also kept the jokes he knew worked, the ones that consistently got laughs.
So those provided the wins.
Exactly. Those reliable bits provided those small wins, that positive feedback to keep his motivation fueled while the newer stuff was being tested and, maybe bombing sometimes.
Yeah, probably.
So it was this constant balancing act. Familiar success mixed with these manageable new challenges. That's likely what kept him engaged and, importantly, progressing over those long years.
It's like constant fine-tuning, isn't it? Never getting too comfortable,
Yeah.
but also not biting off way more than he can chew.
Precisely.
So how can we actually use this? How can we apply this Goldilocks rule to our own habits, our own goals? Whether we're just starting something new or maybe trying to rekindle the motivation for something we've been doing for a while?
Well, for brand new habits, the initial focus really probably should be on making it easy, just getting started.
Right, that links back to Clear's earlier stuff, the third law, make it easy.
Exactly. Lower that barrier to entry as much as possible just to build the initial consistency. Show up.
Just show up.
But once that basic habit is established, that's when the Goldilocks rule becomes really key for keeping the interest alive.
Okay, so how does that look?
It's about strategically introducing small increases in difficulty, or maybe new challenges, new aspects that are still manageable but keep you engaged.
Right. So say your habit is reading daily. Maybe you start with just 1 page a day. That's the easy part.
Yep, make it super easy to start.
What does that just manageable difficulty progression look like then?
Okay, so once reading 1 page feels totally automatic, maybe you gradually increase it, say to 5 pages, then maybe 10.
Still manageable, but a bit more of a stretch.
Exactly. Or maybe you stick with 10 pages,
Yeah.
but you decide to tackle a new genre that's slightly outside your usual comfort zone, something that requires a bit more focus. Ah, okay, so you can tweak the duration or the type of challenge.
Right, and this is also where that concept of flow state often comes into play.
Oh yeah, flow. That feeling of being completely absorbed, like in the zone. How does that connect?
Well, some research suggests that slow states tend to happen when you're facing a task that's roughly 4% beyond your current skill level.
4%? That sounds weirdly specific.
It is, and obviously in the real world, it's not like we can pull out a calculator and measure that 4% precisely for, learning guitar or writing code.
Huh.
But the underlying idea strongly echoes the Goldilocks rule, consistently seeking out challenges that stretch you just a little bit beyond what you can already do easily. That seems to be a powerful driver for that deep engagement, that flow, and ultimately sustained motivation.
That makes a lot of sense. If you're constantly being stretched just a little, you're less likely to get complacent, aren't you?
Exactly. You stay interested. But even with this Goldilocks idea in mind, boredom still seems, inevitable.
Yeah.
Especially with long-term habits.
Yeah, absolutely.
Clear actually calls boredom the greatest villain on the quest for self-improvement. That's a pretty strong statement.
It is a huge obstacle, no question. Clear shares this really insightful little story, an anecdote about an elite weightlifting coach.
Okay.
Someone asked this coach what really differentiated the very best athletes from, well, everyone else.
Yeah, what was the secret? Talent. Drive.
You'd expect answers like that, right? Superior genetics, maybe unwavering passion. But surprisingly, the coach said the biggest difference was the ability to consistently handle the boredom of training.
The boredom? Really?
Just showing up and doing those same repetitive lifts day in, day out, week after week.
Wow. That's such a powerful reframe.
Isn't it?
Because we're constantly bombarded with this idea that passion is the key, right? So when our motivation naturally dips, which it always does,
Always.
we can feel like we're failing somehow. Like, oh, I must not be passionate enough.
Right. Maybe this isn't for me.
But this coach is basically saying that even at the absolute highest levels, motivation isn't constant. It's the ability to push through the routine, even when it feels monotonous. That's what makes the difference.
Precisely. Mastery in pretty much any field requires tons of practice, consistent practice.
And practice is often repetitive.
Exactly. And the more you practice something, the more routine it becomes. And yeah, potentially the more boring it can feel.
Yeah, because the outcome becomes predictable.
Yeah, once you get those initial gains and things become more expected, our interest can start to fade naturally. Our brains like novelty.
Which is why people jump around.
It's often why you see people jumping from one new strategy to the next, a new workout, a new diet plan, a new business idea, the moment they hit that first dip in enthusiasm.
Even if the old thing was actually working.
Even if the previous approach was actually getting them results, it's that pull towards something new.
It's that tempting allure of novelty, isn't it? Clear even quotes Machiavelli on this innate human desire for change.
Right. He notes that even people who are doing well often crave novelty just as much as people who are struggling. It's just built into us, it seems.
So, okay, how do we fight this? this natural drift towards boredom when it comes to the habits we know are good for us.
Well, one approach Clear discusses is trying to incorporate what are called variable rewards.
Variable rewards, what does that mean?
Think about experiences or products that keep us hooked, partly because they have a degree of unpredictability.
Like,
Well, video games are a classic example, right? Constantly shifting challenges, unexpected drops, new levels.
okay,
Or think about social media feeds you scroll, never knowing quite what gem or distraction you'll find next. Even things like junk food can offer a variety of intense sensory hits that keep you coming back.
so it's the unexpected element, the surprise, that keeps us interested.
Exactly. In behavioral psychology terms, a variable reward is one that isn't delivered on a predictable schedule, like slot machines.
Ah, the classic example.
Right. You don't win every time, and the timing of the wins is totally random. This unpredictability actually triggers bigger dopamine releases in the brain.
Dopamine, the reward chemical.
Yep. It strengthens the memory of whatever behavior led to the reward, and it can actually accelerate how quickly a habit forms.
That definitely explains why some of those things can feel so captivating, sometimes even addictive.
They tap into that fundamental brain wiring.
But Clear also makes a really important distinction here. He says variable rewards don't just, create desires out of thin air.
That's crucial. It's a really important point to understand. Variable rewards essentially amplify cravings that are already there. They don't magically make you want something you had zero inclination towards before.
Okay, so they pour fuel on an existing fire, they don't start the fire.
Good way to put it, yeah. He also talks about this idea of the sweet spot of desire,
Sweet spot of desire.
suggesting that maybe a roughly 50-50 split between success and failure can be highly motivating.
What is that?
Well, you get enough wins to feel competent, to feel like you're making progress,
Okay.
but also enough wanting, enough near misses or failures
Yeah.
to maintain your drive, to keep you striving, which, again, kind of loops back to that Goldilocks idea, doesn't it? Tasks being just challenging enough.
Yeah, it does. That 50-50 feels like it's right in that zone. But obviously, not all habits should have variable rewards. You wouldn't want your GPS app to only sometimes give you the right directions.
Huh. No, definitely not. Or your toothbrush to only occasionally clean your teeth properly. Some things need to be reliable. Predictable is good.
Right. So things like Google search, ordering an Uber, flossing, you want consistency there.
Precisely. And even for habits where you might try to introduce some novelty, maybe track your progress in different ways or mix things up slightly, eventually all habits can become somewhat routine. They can risk becoming boring.
So where does that leave us?
It brings us to what is maybe the most crucial concept in the whole chapter for long-term success.
Which is
Learning to fall in love with boredom.
fall in love with boredom.
Yeah.
That sounds like a really tough sell.
It does sound counterintuitive, maybe even impossible. But Clearis argues it's essential if you want to achieve truly significant results over time.
Why?
Because remarkable outcomes require consistency. They require showing up and putting in the effort day after day, even when the work isn't convenient or fun or exciting.
Okay.
He draws this really sharp distinction between professionals and amateurs.
How so?
Professionals, he says, stick to their schedule regardless of how they feel. They show up whether they're motivated or not. Amateurs, on the other hand, tend to let their mood, their motivation levels, or just life's inevitable distractions dictate whether they do the work or not.
That fair weather meditator idea he mentions, or the fair weather athlete or writer.
Exactly. It really resonates, doesn't it? It's about showing up and putting in the reps, even when you're not feeling particularly inspired or energized or passionate that day.
Showing up in any weather, basically.
Basically, yes. And Clear adds his own reflection, saying he rarely, if ever, regrets actually showing up and doing the work, even on those days when his motivation was scraping the bottom. Getting started is often the hardest burst.
Yeah, I can relate to that feeling. You dread doing it, but afterwards you almost never regret having done it.
Right. The core message here seems to be that true excellence, real mastery, often stems from being willing to be endlessly fascinated by the process itself, even the repetitive parts.
Fascinated by repetition.
Yeah, by continually refining and improving even the seemingly mundane aspects of whatever it is you're pursuing, finding satisfaction in the process, not just the outcome.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all together then.
Yeah.
We've talked about the Goldilocks rule, finding that sweet spot of challenge, just manageable difficulty to keep us engaged and motivated.
Right. Not too hard, not too easy.
We've definitely acknowledged that boredom is a major hurdle, maybe the biggest villain. on that long-term path.
A bit inevitable, yeah.
We looked at how variable rewards can sometimes help maintain interest by tapping into our brain's response to unpredictability, though it's not a magic bullet and doesn't apply everywhere.
And it amplifies existing desires, doesn't create new ones.
Exactly. But ultimately, the real key, the fundamental thing for sticking with habits for the long haul, it seems to be about cultivating a different mindset, one that accepts and maybe even learns to embrace the routine.
Yes, falling in love with the process, including the boring bits. Recognizing that consistent effort, even when it feels completely uninspired, is what ultimately leads to mastery and achieving those big long-term goals.
It's about being a professional, not an amateur, in your own life, in your habits.
Well put. Showing up consistently.
So for you, the learner listening right now, maybe take a moment to reflect on a habit you're currently working on. Ask yourself, are you operating in your Goldilocks zone? Is it challenging enough to be engaging, but not so hard that you feel overwhelmed?
Or is it maybe too easy now? Has boredom started to creep in?
And if boredom has set in, think about how you might strategically introduce a small, manageable new challenge. Something to re-engage your interest, just slightly beyond your current edge.
Or maybe, more fundamentally, how can you start to cultivate that professional mindset, that dedication, showing up, finding satisfaction in the consistency itself, even when the initial thrill or novelty has faded?
How can you learn to, maybe not love, but at least appreciate the boredom? That's your deep dive for today.
Thanks for joining us.